This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting the show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast as they discuss hantavirus and how it is transmitted. Kelsey Bentley, K-State Small Ruminant Specialist, continues today's show as she shares reminders for goat and sheep producers as they get ready for breeding season. K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk ends the show providing an update on New World Screwworm and remind Kansas dairy farmers to continue monitoring their herds and calving areas for signs of New World Screwworm. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. Today, we'll listen to Drew and Joe discuss hantavirus.
What is hantavirus, and why should we care about it?
Sure. Well, I think, this has been in the news recently. We've had a bunch of pre-recorded episodes, so it was kind of hard to pull an episode together on this when it was that emerging topic or in the news. But, there was several cases of hantavirus associated with the cruise ship. And those cases of hantavirus are really a special strain or species of the virus that's different from most of them. Hantavirus is a relatively common thing in North America, South America, and I thought that it would be good to kind of talk about this because it's a zoonotic disease.
What's that mean? Zoonotic.
Zoonotic, yeah. Basically means diseases from animals. So it's zoonotic diseases are diseases that animals can give us and that potentially we can pass back to animals. Some of them spread among humans after we acquire the infection from animals, and some of them don't. Some of them just stay in the person that gets them. So hantavirus, most of the time, is an example of a zoonotic disease that humans acquire from critters, and then it never passes from human to human after that.
Is hantavirus really common? We've obviously heard about it on this cruise ship quite a bit, so it's picked up when it shows up, but why is it getting all this news attention?
Well, the news attention is really just because of those cases on the cruise ship. Most of the time, the vast majority of cases that Americans would be familiar with would be called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. And that's in North America and also South America. That would be the most common form of infection that we would get that would be from a virus in the family that encompasses hantavirus. And basically what they are is viruses that small mammals are the main reservoirs for. It's mostly rodents, deer mice, cotton rats, voles, other mice in the same genus that deer mice are in, like white-footed mice, but also shrews and bats, ground squirrels. And so the interesting thing about it is all these different kinds of small mammals have their own specific strain of hantavirus. It can, like the deer mouse strain, can pass to other species, but generally speaking, deer mice have what we call sin nombre virus.
How's this critter going to make me sick, or how is it going to pass the virus to me?
Yeah, so if you read the information that's out there about how it's acquired, what it will say is that most people are infected by either handling rodents or by handling their feces or urine or by handling or disturbing something that is contaminated with their feces or urine. So if we think about those three routes of transmission, handling a rodent, handling their excrement, or disturbing their excrement somehow, as far as I'm aware, there are no documented cases of a mammologist acquiring an infection from handling rodents. And just to kind of put that into perspective, during my graduate research, I handled out in the field with gloved hands most of the time.
Sure.
I handled something like 2,900 individual rodents about 4,500 times. And I did not acquire hantavirus from those rodents. Something along with that when we have sampled for hantavirus in Kansas, including some of the places where I did my dissertation research, something like 19%, between 19 and 30, somewhere in there, I don't remember the exact number, percent of the deer mice have hantavirus.
Oh, really?
Or at least antibodies to hantavirus, indicating that they have at some point in their life had the infection. And so it's not that I wasn't handling rodents in a place where I could have acquired hantavirus. So when we think about how most people get it, it's actually by disturbing feces or dust that's contaminated with urine in a closed environment. So really, if we're thinking about avoiding a hantavirus infection in North America, the first best way to avoid it would be to not allow rodent infestations to occur in an enclosed space.
I try hard to do that. I live in the country, and rodents are still they're smart critters, and they're going to make their way in, right?
Yeah.
So I guess you can take all those steps, and they can still get in. And if you see evidence, even after you're doing all those steps, are there things we can do other than just sweep?
Absolutely. So the recommendation is mop or scoop, don't sweep. And before you mop or scoop, you need to wet down the dust and the feces and the stuff that could be contaminated with urine with a disinfectant. And so if you got that Lysol concentrate and you mixed it according to the label with water and then wet the area down that's contaminated with feces and urine and dust and all that kind of stuff, and then use a mop or shovel it if it's deep and handle it that way rather than contaminating the air with dust.
Sure.
And the best practice would also to be to wear an N95 mask while you're doing that.
So you're cleaning up, you're doing everything you can. I mean, it's still possible that you can get sick from all this stuff, right? And so, do we need to be scared of these critters? Do we just need to kind of be aware of this? What are we trying to do there?
Well, it's something to be aware of. So, especially if you have a shed or something like that gets a bunch of rodents in it, or if you go to like remote cabins on Forest Service land in Colorado or Arizona or New Mexico or California. There's even a lot of cases, relatively speaking, in like Washington State. If you go to a remote cabin and there's a bunch of rodent feces, be prepared to clean them up appropriately rather than going in there and just sweeping everything up into the air. That's the most important thing to be aware of with this. And this hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is not something that passes from human to human. So we don't have to worry about that human-to-human transmission route. But, if you did get sick, then it could be very important for either you or a loved one to be able to communicate with the doctors and let them know that you have been potentially in an area where you could have been exposed to this by cleaning up those feces so that they know what precautions to take when they're treating you.
Sure. Don't start pumping you full of IVs.
Right. And so you might think, well, what are they going to do? How do they treat me if they can't do that?
Yeah.
And, the modern advances in treatment of pulmonary diseases are really aiding in helping reduce that mortality rate that's associated with this disease. So you might have heard the word ECMO when folks were talking about how we treated people during the pandemic with COVID-19. And that ECMO machine basically, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it's a machine that helps maybe do your breathing for you, and it does that by oxygenating your blood outside of your body. And so then it can even if your lungs do fill up with fluid and not associated with an IV, but that can still do the work that the lungs are supposed to do and keep you alive while your body's fighting off that infection and dealing with that.
Yeah, it's crazy the advances that we see. And, we've been saying that for ages, right? There's a lot of really, really smart, hardworking people out there coming up with a lot of new techniques to help move us along.
Yeah.
So, you've mentioned, Drew, a few times that we don't know that it's really spread from person to person, but I think that I've heard of some cases where at least they think that's what happened. So, do you have any idea what might be going on in those situations?
Yeah, so that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? The cruise ship cases. Yeah. And that is a specific strain of hantavirus called Andes virus. So, we were talking about sin nombre virus from the deer mouse. Andes virus is a different kind of hantavirus, and it is known to be spread from person to person. And so that's what those folks had on the cruise ship that we all heard about in the news. And it's a very specific species of hantavirus that humans can acquire, but it's still not, we think about the cold or the flu as being viruses that can be passed easily from person to person because they're airborne. Andes virus is not airborne. It comes from very close contact from human to human. So, maybe exchange of body fluids or touching body fluids or touching a surface and then eating that without washing your hands after somebody else that was infected contaminated that surface.
Sure.
And so that's why even in a very confined space with probably thousands of people on a cruise ship, there was like a dozen or fewer people that were actually infected by this.
Yeah.
So that Andes virus is a hantavirus, and that's what caused the human-to-human transmission of hantavirus associated with that cruise ship that we all heard about.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to hear the full hantavirus episode, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, going to wildlife.k-state.edu, or by simply searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing getting ready for goat and sheep breeding with K-State Small Ruminant Specialist Kelsey Bentley. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Shelby. Thank you for having me on.
Kelsey, as we're thinking about this, what are some first things you recommend producers to get prepared?
So first things first, I think it's important for us to know the difference in terms of the reproductive cycle between sheep and goats. So sheep traditionally have a 17-day estrus cycle, whereas our goat counterparts are actually going to have more of a 21-day estrus cycle. So understanding that, and that there are in fact some differences in terms of puberty. So sheep are going to mature around 5 to 12 months of age, whereas goats are going to be more 6 to 8 months of age. So making sure they're at an appropriate age, it's the appropriate season, and you would like for those ewes and bucks to mate up is kind of going to be paramount. After that, I think it's now vital for us to start thinking about some health parameters. If you introduce any new male to your flock, whether that be a ram or a buck, I think it's vital that we quarantine them for at least 30 days. So we should not be buying in brand new rams and immediately turning those out with ewes or does. I think for our males in particular, we also need to make sure that they have a breeding soundness exam to make sure that everything's functioning appropriately and that they can in fact breed ewes. Going more towards our ewes or our doe basis, I really think it's important for us to begin to monitor body condition scoring on those individuals. So it is proven that anything that has a body condition score of less than a 2 is less likely to have more ovulatory events. So normally we say on a 5-point scale, so 5 being obese and 1 being very thin, we would like ewes and does to be sitting at a 3. We would then like to nutritionally flush them. So approximately 2 weeks prior to that breeding, we would maybe give them some sort of a high quality pasture or forage or even a concentrate per head, starting 2 weeks prior to when we turn in the male. This is just also scientifically proven to increase our ovulatory events, and hopefully we see more settling and more lambs. So leading up to breeding, those are kind of the things that we need to be mindful of as we look towards our matings.
You mentioned body condition score for does and ewes, but is it also something to take in consideration when we're thinking about our bucks and rams?
that is in fact a main consideration we need to have also. So just like with our does, normally if we get rams that are too thin or too fat, we can see decreased sperm quality. And in Kansas, it's actually interesting because sometimes when I go and look at males, if they're just kind of lounging around and not having to do very much, they can in fact start to creep up in terms of their body condition. So we can start to get towards the fours. And those rams technically will have just an increased risk of decreased sperm quality. And I would say when in doubt, if you're like, oh, I don't really know, I'm not great at body condition scoring males, it's better for them to be a little bit on the heavier side than the thinner side. Because we think that as he's out with females, he could potentially lose a half to a full point in terms of body condition if he's doing his job appropriately.
Any health or medical considerations for these animals?
The main health checks that I kind of want to see on the sheep side, at least, and I guess some of them are on the goat side, but on the sheep side, first things first, we probably should shear out ewes before we breed those ewes. It keeps them cooler, it keeps everything nice and clean. So if, you've got ewes that have, 3/4 to an inch of fleece, it's probably a good idea to maybe get them shorn down. Outside of that, what's unanimous across both species, make sure hooves are trimmed and there's no limping or there's no gait abnormalities. We also need to be looking for parasites. So right now is peak parasite season. I'm not sure everyone is breeding currently, but if you are, we are in the kind of heat of the parasite season. So while we're kind of going through and doing some pre-breeding vaccinations, it's probably a good idea for us to go ahead and just FOMACHA score or check the ocular membranes of our does or ewes, make sure that they're nice and red and they appear to be healthy. If not, it's probably a good idea for us to go ahead and give them some sort of a combination dewormer treatment. And I talked about those pre-breeding vaccinations. They can vary depending on your farm and depending on your individual flock or herd's history. However, I always love to recommend some sort of a clostridial. I personally like to see a clostridial 8-way vaccination, giving us lots of protection for different clostridial diseases that ewe or doe can then pass on to lamb. But that isn't always the case. I'm sure some producers out there just give the traditional CD&T vaccine. That works just as well. They're both kind of covering the same. That 8-way just has a few more strains of Clostridium within it. Then some producers, if they have had problems with chlamydia or Campylobacter in the past, could potentially go to Colorado Serum Company and get some of those vaccines to do pre-breeding also. It just kind of depends on your history. I have some producers that don't really like to use some of those pre-breeding vacs, and instead they kind of transitioned more to a preventative LA200 to fight back against some of those bacterial abortive diseases. But the clostridial vaccine is one that I like to see administered approximately 30 days before lambing or kidding.
What are some different ways that you've seen producers track making sure that their ewes or does are getting bred?
Yes, so there's lots of different ways. The one that I think is probably the most commonly used is going to be some sort of a breeding harness. And that kind of is a harness that goes in between the palate of a buck or a ram. And as he is mating a ewe, he will make a colored mark on that ewe or on that doe. Those colored marks, if we go out and check daily or twice daily, we can then start to see if she has settled or if she is recycling or coming back into heat. So for this kind of breeding marking system to work, you will need to do paint changes, because if he's consistently marking the same color over and over and over again, you might not be able to tell that that color has changed. So I recommend we change that color out every 18 days for sheep and every 21 days for goats. And then you'll have to come out daily, do a check of who's getting marked, what date they were marked, and then also make sure that we're starting with light crown colors and we're going to darker crown colors. I've also been guilty of that, like grabbing out a blue crown and a yellow crown doesn't mark very well on top of a blue crown. So making sure we're starting with light crowns, we're transitioning to darker colors, and we're going out and we're checking and recording that breeding activity to check for, number one, recycling females, but also to see who's potentially settled. And then we could come back out 30 days later. We could potentially do a blood pregnancy test to let us know who we think is pregnant. And then even further out, we could call up our vet, have them come out and do some fetal scanning for us to kind of give us a sense of whether or not we have twins or triplets or singles.
Any facility considerations when it comes to potentially putting these breeding pens together?
Yes. So for facilities, once again, it's something that we see vastly different among all small ruminant producers. So while I might, say one thing that's ideal, it certainly doesn't have to be this way. But in an ideal world, for facilities, you could breed all out on pasture and have no problem whatsoever, and then be able to kind of take that male out of the pasture and hopefully have a little area for him, like a ram barn or some sort of a ram pen where he could just kind of stay away from those females. After that, I think transitioning into lambing and kidding is maybe where our facilities become a little bit more vital. I would like to see some sort of a jug set up. And when I say jug, I just mean a little 4x4 or 5x5 area where once a doe or a ewe has lambed or kidded, that we can put them into this jug. We can facilitate some bonding there between hopefully her twins. And then 48 hours later, we can turn them out kind of into a group pen. It allows us to have a little bit of a better sense of how those lambs are doing, make sure everyone's nursing, make sure things are working appropriately before we just kind of turn them out just willy-nilly. Now, are there some producers in Kansas that probably lamb out on pasture or kid out on pasture? Absolutely. And if that's working for you and that's what you've got going, by all means, continue to do so. For death loss purposes, we see pretty marked death loss when we're lambing or kidding out on pasture because we can just be a little bit less intensive about our management. So if you do have the opportunity or the option to be able to maybe intensively manage those ewes or those does a little bit better, it normally works to our advantage, and we see that gains from death loss.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
All right. Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Small Ruminant Specialist Kelsey Bentley. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As the new World Screwworm continues to be a concern, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk reminds Kansas producers to continue monitoring their herds and calving areas for signs of NWS.
Today I'd like to update our Kansas dairy producers concerning New World Screwworm and where we're seeing activity here in the United States. As of this morning, there were 15 total cases reported across Texas and one case being in New Mexico. So we are seeing some spread, and it seems like every few days we learn of a new infection emerging from one of the counties in Texas. Keep in mind that there are strict quarantines being put in place around each of these new cases, and also additional zone around that where they're doing increased monitoring. So we are trying to keep abreast of where the insects might be moving and where we're finding the larvae in animals. So as a Kansas producer, what should you be concerned about? Well, number one, if you would be happening to travel into Texas, I'd encourage you to make sure you take a look at the most current screwworm location map to make sure that you're not traveling into an area that's actually under quarantine. If you do travel into an area that's under quarantine, you just want to make sure that, number one, if you're moving any animals, that you have the proper authority to do that, because we are controlling movement of animals out of those zones where we actually have a quarantine in place. And again, we really don't want to carry this any further north by moving animals. So it is very important that we follow those quarantines. It's also important that if you do travel into one of these quarantine areas that you carefully check to make sure that you're not bringing any screwworms north with you when you return. So it's not very likely that you would see it in humans, but it is very possible, although not as common as we would see in animals. On your dairy farms, what should you be thinking about? Well, number one, make sure you just keep a very close eye on any animals that might have wounds. Make sure you treat those and cover those if possible. In your calving area, be especially diligent in observing your newborn calves, as the umbilical cord area is a primary place where we sometimes find the screwworm larva. If you do see a spot on your animal, either in a wound or maybe in the umbilical cord area that seems to be enlarging and painful to the animal, make sure you get that checked out by your veterinarian to make sure that you don't have an animal that has a screwworm larvae infection in it. Now, if we take care of our animals, if we remain vigilant, if we find that we do have a wound or another area on the animal that is infected with screwworm larvae, we have treatments that are very, very effective. So it's very easy to treat these animals and rid the animal of the infestation. We do expect that we will see more cases across Texas, and it is possible that at some point in time this summer we might see the larvae move as far north as Kansas. That's not out of the realm of possibilities. So we do need to make sure that we stay vigilant. I would also mention that the food supply is safe. So whether it be meat or milk, we have inspection programs in place for these particular products, so we don't have to worry about the safety of the food supply in our grocery stores. It is safe, and we just need to be concerned about controlling the movement of the screwworm flies north as much as we can, and part of that is all of us just being very diligent and very observant to make sure that we don't inadvertently move the flies north or the screwworm larvae north, and making sure that we keep a close eye on all of our animals to make sure that if there is a spread, we detect it quickly and get those animals treated as soon as possible. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to continue to be very diligent in their inspection of animals and on the watch out for screwworm larvae.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.